Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Having a slight change in format just because of all of the COVID-19 and everything that's been going on with that. We will be looking at just some different material this week, not necessarily going to be going as in-depth as we have in the past. Should be getting back to the more regular content that you're used to on this particular podcast in the next couple episodes or so. But today we're going to focus a lot on just science fiction content that you might find enjoyable to listen to or watch while we are kind of dealing with all of the restrictions, social distancing. I know that a lot of us have way more time on our hands than we ever thought we would, which is both great and not so great for some people, I'm sure. And we've also got like kids around that normally aren't around and things like that. So just wanted to kind of engage in some more content recommendation based stuff rather than be super in depth. Though at some point today we will be talking about some of the more in depth subjects that we do normally talk about. But on that note, I wanted to kind of start us off with some suggestions for things that are streaming on Netflix or Hulu or Amazon that I thought looked pretty enjoyable, and kind of talk about what I think might be cool about them and where they're drawing some of their influences from, and just kind of share with you my thoughts on them. So on that note, we'll get right into the first kind of recommendation that I have for you guys this week, and that is for a movie that is currently streaming on Netflix. The movie is called Evolution, and if you were a young adult in the early 2000s, I'm sure that you saw trailers or something like that for this. The trailer is pretty funny. It is definitely on the lighter side as far as science fiction content is concerned. I know that I normally deal with, or talk about rather, a lot of the more heady things in science fiction, but I will say that there is definitely a space for things like this and a lot of reason to watch it. It's only rated PG-13, so it's probably something that you could watch with some of your kids if they're at home, which I imagine for a lot of you, if you have kids, they are at home because school is pretty much canceled currently. So the basic storyline of the film is that a meteorite falls to Earth, and two college professors, Dr. Ira Kane and Professor Harry Phineas. Ira Kane is played by David Duchovny, and then Phineas is played by Orlando Jones. And this movie actually also has some pretty familiar names. It's got Dan Aykroyd in there, as well as Julianne Moore, Michelle Wolf, and Sarah Silverman, which is pretty great. I definitely love me some Sarah Silverman. She's a pretty good comedian and a great actress. So, at the site of this meteorite, they discover organisms that are not of this planet. Soon the site is taken over by the government, forcing Ira and Harry to the side. As new life forms begin to evolve and start to get more and more dangerous, it's up to the two professors to save the planet. So it's pretty standard, kind of like science fiction. I don't know if I would necessarily call it parody, but pretty standard science fiction comedy plot. The trailer is understandably funny, and it looks like things get pretty wacky throughout the film, which I imagine is pretty enjoyable. It definitely feels like it was kind of influenced by the success of things like Attack on Mars and maybe even Independence Day. Not totally sure if Independence Day came out before or after this, but it's got like your standard set of characters as far as I can tell. It kind of feels like they took the cast of Jurassic Park and said, well, what if it was an alien instead of science fiction? You have your kind of like action hero-y dude, your loud minority comedic relief. In the trailer, there's a scene that I found to be pretty hilarious that made me kind of want to watch the movie, where they're talking about how there's an alien inside of this guy's suit, and then it's inside of his body, and they have to remove it via a specific orifice, and the doctor says there's no time for lubricant, and the gentleman responds by saying there always is time for lubricant. So I just thought that was pretty funny. If you have enjoyed things that are like science fiction comedy or just kind of like straight up unapologetically action science fiction type movie things, then I really think that you could enjoy this piece of content. I don't necessarily know that it's going to provide any deep and meaningful insight into your life, but not everything has to do that, and sometimes it's just fun to have a good time with things. And the director of the film, Ivan Reitman, has actually a pretty substantial body of work that he was mostly a producer for. But he's been a producer on a lot of films that we would be familiar with. He was a producer on Hitchcock. He did I Love You Man as well, Hotel for Dogs. So just based off of his catalog of work, I can imagine that this movie definitely does the rest of that justice. For the next kind of recommendation that I have you guys looking at, I wanted to talk about something a little bit more serious. The next movie is kind of like a borderline science fiction movie, a little bit more of a drama. It is the movie Her, which came out in 2013. I believe it's streaming on Netflix currently. Directed by Spike Jonze, who did things like Adaptation, Becoming John Malkovich, and some other really interesting films. It has Joaquin Phoenix, Chris Pratt is in it, Rooney Marie is in it, as is Bill Hader, Kristen Wiig is in there, Scarlett Johansson stars, as does Amy Adams as a couple of the key roles. The storyline is basically that there's a gentleman named Theodore who is very lonely and in the final stages of his divorce. When he's not working as a letter writer, his downtime is spent playing video games and occasionally hanging out with friends. He decides to purchase the new OS-1, which is advertised as the world's first artificially intelligent operating system. And they say it's not just an operating system, it's a consciousness, the ad says. Theodore quickly finds himself drawn in with Samantha, who is the AI, and it is the voice that Scarlett Johansson plays. As they start spending time together, they grow closer and closer and eventually find themselves in love. Having fallen in love with his OS operating system, Theodore finds himself dealing with feelings of both great joy and doubt. As an operating system, Samantha has powerful intelligence that she uses to help Theodore in ways others hadn't. But how does she help him deal with his inner conflict of being in love with an operating system? And I've heard a lot of really good things about this movie. I haven't personally gotten around to watching it yet, but I have always really wanted to. I am a big fan of Joaquin Phoenix. I think that he does excellent work. We can all remember how good he was in Gladiator. I've never hated somebody so much. And of course, he did recently do that Joker movie that everybody loved a lot. I think he won an award or two for it. Not totally sure off the top of my head. But the movie Her is kind of, I guess you would say it's a little similar in fashion to Joker because it's dealing with self-actualization, mental health, and wrestling with feelings of difficulties that you're having in the world and how to cope with them. The plot of the movie is pretty unique and interesting. And like I said, while it's only kind of remotely related to science fiction, I feel like it's a good recommendation. The trailer felt very cathartic for me personally, which I think is just kind of a sign of the emotional intelligence of the director and the writers who made the film, and just an encouragement to watch it and really give it a shot and give some deep thought as to the things that are being explored. We've talked about on this podcast before the ideas behind artificial intelligence developing consciousness and whether or not that would constitute them as being a real person. And I think that this film does a good job of exploring that subject matter further. I mentioned before on a couple podcast episodes ago a movie with Robin Williams called The Bicentennial Man, which did something similar as well. So I think that if you're into that kind of stuff and you like dramas, then this could be a film that you could find a lot of enjoyment in. And I will have some more recommendations for you and some science fiction news later on in the podcast of things that are kind of happening right now in the media department for science fiction right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Suggestions that I had for you guys to stream on Netflix. I think they're both on Netflix. One was the movie Evolution, which is like a science fiction comedy film. And then I also talked briefly about the film Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix, which is much darker. Another just bit of content that you guys might find enjoyable to watch. Just in looking around at different things on the interwebs to try and find things that I thought might be worthy of recommendation, I stumbled across a Netflix original series that is designed to serve as a prequel for a movie from the 80s, which a lot of people are pretty familiar with, called The Dark Crystal. The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance is a TV series that is, I believe, produced by or someone from the creator of the Muppets, Jim Henson, is involved with, and it just looks really fascinating. I personally haven't gotten a chance to watch much of it, but so far I've been really impressed with the visual effects that they use. A lot of films rely pretty heavily on computer or digitally based special effects, but the production team for this TV show have been very committed to using more practical effects, which I think makes for a much more enjoyable experience because of a phenomena that we kind of know as, I think it's called Erie Valley. And what Erie Valley is Erie Valley is this idea that there is a line in our minds where things start to look... Oh, sorry, it's not called Erie Valley. It's called the Uncanny Valley. Just remember that. Uncanny Valley. And it is this line that exists within our minds that at some point things start to look too real. And because they look too real, we realize that they are fake. Some great examples are the Polar Express is one of those where it just exists in Uncanny Valley the entire time. because the people who animated the film were trying to make it look so hyper-realistic, like one of those, hyper-realistic paintings, that as we're watching it, our brain is telling us, like, no, these are not real people, so we can't look at them as real people, but at the same time, our brain is acknowledging that they have at least some features of real people. So oftentimes we get into this uncanny valley, or we get into this place where we can tell that something is special effects. A good example film-wise of this would be the movie Inception. A lot of the camera angles and cinematography in that film are done using practical effects, where they actually spun the camera around to spin the room around, or they actually spun the entire room around rather than just, spinning the camera around and putting some like cotton starch in somebody's coat so it looked like they were walking upside down, or that type of a thing. So when we get these films that have more practical effects, we can engage with them because our brain ultimately knows that they are fake. And so we can operate under the assumption that this thing is fake rather than live in this world where it's like, well, is it real? How do I relate to it? So I just think that aesthetically the show is very pleasing. Which in itself isn't necessarily the only reason that you should watch it. I do think that there's a lot of history behind this particular franchise, and a lot of people who were either traumatized or loved the movie from the 80s. But it's definitely worth taking a look at, especially if you enjoy something that's unique and interesting. The plotline seems pretty basic. You've got your, like, good guys, bad guys rebellion against an established power who's kind of a despot in a certain number of ways, and pretty murderous as far as I can tell. So, pretty basic, but definitely worth taking a look at. Now, for the next recommendation that I have for you guys, it is a TV series called The Expanse. It started in 2015. The basic storyline is that about 200 years in the future, the solar system has been fully colonized, and a police detective by the name of Josephus, I don't know, Miller, who was born in a colony on the asteroid belt, is given the assignment to find a missing young woman named Julie Mao. At that same time, a gentleman named James Holden, who is a first officer of an ice freighter, is witness to an unprovoked attack on the ship by a craft that they believe came from Mars. As news of the attack spreads throughout the system, the incident's flow on threatens to destabilize already tenuous relationships between the miscellaneous colonies on Earth, Mars, and the asteroid belt, which is called the Belt. Far away from the struggles in deep space on Earth, Christian Vasarla, an interesting last name, who is a United Nations executive and diplomat, works to prevent war between Earth and Mars by any means. Soon, all three of them will find out that the missing woman and the ice freighter's fate are part of a vast covert conspiracy which threatens all of humanity. And the plotline of this seems pretty interesting. It's actually kind of akin to the Hyperion series that I mentioned that I've been reading, which I promise I will get around to talking about. I may just have to give up on reading the actual book and start listening to the ebook so that we can actually start talking about that subject matter. But that's neither here nor there. If you have been reading that book, good on you. It is a really great book. But The Expanse is streaming on, I believe, Amazon Prime, and it just looks really great. I, for one, am a big proponent of like multifaceted conspiracy type shows where there's like twists and turns in the plot at multiple points throughout the storyline. And it just seems like this particular series does a good job of that. The acting isn't necessarily, something to write home about, but as a lot of us know, frequently the content of something is much more important than the execution of it. The Fifth Element is a great example of that. The content isn't necessarily great, but the execution is so good that it makes you want to watch it again and again, which, while we're on the note of recommendations, you should definitely check out The Fifth Element. It's got Bruce Willis and Gary Oldman. I think I mentioned it last week. But as far as The Expanse is concerned, definitely looks like something worth spending some time on while you're in quarantine. Or if you are not in quarantine and you're listening to this after the fact, then it's definitely something that I would highly recommend. Now, after the break, we are going to kind of get into some of the content that we have generally been more dedicated to in this podcast. I wanted to kind of touch on the purpose that some of these more lighthearted science fiction pieces of content have in the overall landscape of science fiction itself, because I often will focus on the more heady or intellectual side of science fiction, and I think that there's kind of some important concepts that we miss out on from things that are a little bit more lighthearted in nature. But we will get to that right after this quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So right before the break, and for the first couple parts of this podcast, we had just been focusing a lot on content suggestions for you guys to watch during your COVID-19 stay-at-home quarantine orders, whatever they're at right now. And now I kind of wanted to talk about something that is a little bit more akin to what we normally talk about on the podcast here, and that is this idea of there being kind of like a line between intellectual science fiction content and more casual science fiction content. Now, I will say that I am personally of the belief that there is a line, in fact, between what one should consider to be casual science fiction content and what one should be, or what one should consider to be the more intellectual or the heady science fiction content. And that line is usually pretty easy to delineate. We've got things like, and I mentioned it several times on this podcast, like The Fifth Element versus something like the movie Annihilation, right? Now, ultimately, I don't necessarily think that thriller movies or comedies are trying to say anything particularly profound about the human experience, but that doesn't mean that they aren't accidentally doing so in the process of executing the comedy or other like action aspects of the film. So while there definitely are films that fall into one category or another, I think that as viewers, it's important for us to enter into the space of viewing science fiction from a more profound and informed mentality. And what I mean by that is that as you go to consume a piece of science fiction content, when you are watching it, there is always an opportunity for you to learn something or glean something from that particular subject matter. So if I'm sitting down to watch Evolution, and I've got my popcorn, and I'm all ready to go, looking forward to enjoying this funny movie, then I can enter into it with a headspace of just kind of like blindly consuming it and taking it for what it is, but I think ultimately that means a lot of the more important aspects of science fiction as a genre will be kind of lost on me. And we talked a lot about the responsibility of the viewer when we were talking about escapism a couple episodes back. And I specifically made mention that I think that escapism is the fault of the viewer and not the fault of the creator. And I stand pretty firmly on that statement because I believe that ultimately, as consumers, it is our responsibility to seek out meaning in things. And of course, this has its roots in like existential philosophy. Pretty much any philosophy is going to tell you that you get to apply value to things. But I think that when we take this approach to science fiction content, we're going to find ourselves being much more satisfied. Because it's easy to watch a movie like Total Recall, the original, not the reboot, which again I have seen but forgot so much of it that I can't even talk about it. If we just look at Total Recall at face value, then we've got, Arnold Schwarzenegger in this kind of conspiracy-oriented action film. And we aren't giving ourselves the cognitive distance necessary to start conceptualizing different parts of the world and different parts of human experience and deciding whether or not those things are real. But as we went over a couple weeks ago, it's pretty easy to have a substantial discussion on content that is seemingly benign, like Total Recall is on surface level. But when you get into the nitty-gritty of Total Recall and you think to yourself, well, what if I was Arnold Schwarzenegger and I was this confused, or I felt like, these odd feelings of deja vu, well, then now we're actually entering into a space where we can start to think critically about something that a lot of people would say isn't worthy of critical thought. But I'm of the opinion that pretty much everything is worthy of critical thought, and I know that sounds very intimidating, and while it can be at times, overall, when we approach things as conscious viewers, as conscious consumers, then I think that we're going to find that things are much more enjoyable. Star Wars is a great example of something that ultimately is very simple in its premise, and even somewhat simple in its execution, though at the time that it was made, it was definitely pioneering a lot of things. But it does a really just incredible job of taking things, or taking a benign concept like good guys versus bad guys and portraying it in a way that makes it so that we're kind of forced to think about the situation that is in front of us. And not every movie is going to be able to do this effectively, but good ones will do exactly that. They will force us to create that cognitive distance between characters or between individuals that will allow us to have the space necessary to turn around and say, well, how does this actually affect me? Or what does this mean for my life moving forward? So when I make recommendations like the movie Evolution, am I saying that we should watch it in a way that makes us think that it's the greatest thing ever? No, probably not. Am I even saying that it's objectively a good movie? I mean, it certainly looks funny, but no, I don't know if it's objectively a good movie. But what I am saying is that it's important for us to kind of set ourselves up for success when it comes to consuming content in any regard, but especially with science fiction, because there is such a delicate line between, using it as a form of escape or using it as a form of intellectual opportunity. And science fiction is just such a huge genre that I really think it deserves our educated and intentional consumption, because if we don't do that, then we end up in this space where we're just simply escaping from the things around us rather than actually reflecting on their importance or their impact that they have on us as individuals. And ultimately, I think that a lot of the value from science fiction comes from the fact that it can have a profound impact on us as individuals rather than just something that we kind of watch and forget. So when we come back from the break, I'm going to talk about a study that was recently done by some scientists that is related to topics that we've talked about in the past. And then as we get towards the end of the podcast, we will probably talk some more about suggestions or recommendations or maybe some more science fiction news as things come out. There has been a lot of changes to the schedule of like production for movies and things like that because of COVID-19. And there are some films that I would like to talk about that I think are coming, probably going to be available to stream online or rent or things like that. So we should definitely be watching out for some of those. So we will be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Approaching things in science fiction and really all forms of media that you choose to consume with a more critical and self-aware mindset. And on that note, I wanted to talk about a study that was recently done, recently being in the last couple years, where a couple of individuals at a college had a experiment to find out what kind of genres helped to increase the engagement of readers as they are reading a story. So like what kind of things are going to solicit empathy from the audience, are going to create a literary experience where individuals have placed themselves into the world it is that they are reading about. And what this study found is that ultimately science fiction as a genre is a genre that lowers the engagement of individuals who are reading it. So that what they found was essentially that there is a bias against science fiction within the general populace that creates a sort of mentality when someone goes to read a science fiction short story. It creates a mentality that that story is not as good or not worth engaging in. So they kind of used the sensational headline, reading science fiction makes you stupid, which ultimately is not a very accurate depiction of what the study is said to have proven. But I think that it's worth stating that that is partially true. Because when you are reading something and you suddenly find yourself not engaging with it, then you are, mindlessly doing something. And I would argue that doing things mindlessly is definitely a route to consuming things in improper ways. So when they did this study, I believe it was about 3 or 4 years ago, they found that it wasn't necessarily that science fiction itself made individuals stop engaging in the content or believe that the story was not as good as other stories. What they found is that there's a bias when specific tropes in science fiction are used in the story. Individuals will disengage because it becomes that type of story. So what really was being said is that basic science fiction is not a good medium by which to write a story. And I'm sure that I'll get some critique for this statement, but so, for instance, Star Wars is an example of very basic science fiction. Oh, look, it's in space. There's people with funny names and magic powers, and there's good guys and bad guys, kind of like I mentioned earlier. It's a very basic and ultimately kind of like universally human, easy to digest, kind of like science pop culture thing. But, and the reason that I wanted to share this information, they actually just recently did a study, I think last year, where they revisited this bias and they actually found out some new information. So when they initially did the testing for this particular, genre bias, they found at the end, like I just mentioned, that there was a bias towards science fiction tropes. So when they redid this study, they approached the science fiction genre from two separate angles. The first angle, they used very basic language to just say a robot is cleaning a wine glass. In the second one, they humanized the robot in a way that created a sense of mystery for the reader, so they weren't sure exactly what type of thing, or they just assumed it was a person who was cleaning the wine glass. And what they found is that science fiction tropes actually increase the amount of engagement and the amount of conceptualization that individuals can have while consuming content. And I've mentioned in the past that I am a firm believer that the content of science fiction is one that necessitates a certain amount of cognitive distance from real life. And through that cognitive distance, we become uncomfortable and comfortable simultaneously enough to turn around and look at our lives from a different viewpoint. And what they found is that bad science fiction, basic science fiction, has been so rampant in our culture that when individuals start to see basic science fiction tropes, they will actively disengage from the story that's being told. They will actively not empathize with the characters, and they will actively think less of what it is that is being written. So myself, as an individual who is a writer, I found this information to be very valuable because, again, as a proponent of having informed and critical readers and consumers of content, knowing that my kind of theorizing or hypothesis about the idea of cognitive distance, about the effectiveness of it as a medium through the use of science fiction tropes, knowing that that is affirmed by science actually makes me feel pretty good about myself for having thought of discussing that particular idea. So what this means for us as science fiction fans, I guess it gives us some ground to stand on as far as the critique that I'd mentioned from individuals like Bill Maher or Maher. I don't know how to say his name exactly. I'm not a huge fan of his talk shows or anything like that. And I'm not very much in the political realm, so I don't really know what it is that he comments on. But he, as I said before a couple episodes ago, mentioned that he thought that people who consumed comic books ultimately were stuck in a perpetual form of childhood. And I just ultimately didn't agree with that. And studies like this give us a leg to stand on when people start to critique things. Because essentially what we can say is like, yeah, I get it. You are put off by funny names and laser swords. But what if I could show you a story like, a good example would probably be Ender's Game, where space only serves to kind of talk about universal human principles. Ender's Game does a really good job of using the setting of science fiction as a way to enhance or make analogous certain things in strategy. Ender has to participate in these battle simulations between students at the school that he attends. And in those simulations, there is no gravity. And that's definitely a science fiction trope. But if we were to just look at it like, oh, there's no gravity, so it's a science fiction trope, I guess I can disengage from this, then we would miss out on the fact that there are deep and profound parables being told through Ender's perspective as he goes through all of these trials. So when someone goes to critique you about liking science fiction, you should definitely cite this study, which was written by John Courtenay Grimwood, I believe. Not totally sure who he did the study for. I always guess Brown University. Okay, Washington Lee University. It's Professors Chris Gaviler and Dan Johnson who did this study. And the article is up on The Guardian, so you can read the original article, which again has that kind of like salacious, science fiction makes you stupider type thing. or makes you stupid. I don't think stupider is a word. Is it a word? I don't know. I feel stupider than normal for not knowing if stupider is a word. I'm going to Google it in a couple minutes here. But you can definitely look up the article. It's a quick read, but I definitely advise, well, if I say definitely one more time, then I give you permission to skip ahead to the commercial break that's coming up in a couple moments here. But it's worth the read. It's educational to learn about how we as readers engage with content, and it helps to inform us as we engage with more content. So that kind of does it for that particular segment of the show. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the things that were delayed in release by COVID-19. I may have talked about them on the podcast before, but I'd like to mention them again just because a lot of them looked really cool, and I wanted to recommend them or talk about why I think they're cool, just because that's a thing that I enjoy doing. So we will be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
So as we're getting out of here today, I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about something that is probably on the tip of everybody's tongues. The newest Rick and Morty trailer for, I believe it's season 4, has just been released. Adult Swim had ordered a bunch of episodes, I guess, from Rick and Morty, if that's what you want to call it. I think that they have them signed up for a while. I know that Adult Swim has been the home of Rick and Morty for, I believe, the majority of its lifetime. I know it was on YouTube or full episodes were on YouTube, but that's just kind of Adult Swim's thing, is to put up full episodes in as many places as possible, because a lot of their shows are kind of experimental or just really different. So I just wanted to kind of take a brief moment to talk about the fact that the trailer makes it seem like this next season is going to be, I don't know if I'd say more of the same, but it's definitely going to be very interesting, to say the least. Rick and Morty is a really good show. If you haven't watched it, I believe that I've talked about why it is that I love the show so much several times on the podcast. So definitely look at the back catalog for recommendations on different episodes to watch. And as we're getting out of here today, I want to kind of make a random suggestion for you for another show that is also available on Adult Swim, so it's definitely adult-oriented, but this show is just absolutely crazy and hilarious, and that show is called Neon Joe Werewolf Hunter. Now, this show is definitely not for the faint of heart. Not that it's necessarily super gory, just that it is absolutely ridiculous. It stars John Glazer, who plays Neon Joe. It's set in a city called, or a town rather, called Garrity, Vermont, and it's basically a story about a neon-clad man with a mysterious past and a highly specialized skill set, which is, of course, hunting werewolves. John Glazer is pretty familiar to us. He has been in a couple of other shows or movies that we might be familiar, though primarily as a writer. He served as a writer for 22 episodes of the Jenny McCarthy Show. He's written for late night shows quite frequently, the show Freak Show. So he is definitely an experienced individual in the entertainment industry, and he does a great job in Neon Joe Werewolf Hunter. The show is kind of like a parody mixed with like surrealism and a couple other things. It's just kind of ridiculous. If you like things like the original Anchorman or other Adult Swim shows like Moral Oral, then you'll definitely enjoy this one. There are only 10 episodes, but they do a pretty good job of like telling a story, developing a character, and then wrapping up that story with a, I guess you could call a nice, neat little bow. So that about does it for today, everybody. Just to kind of go over what we talked about in the podcast again. At the top of the show, I recommended a movie that is on Netflix called Evolution. It's a science fiction comedy. Definitely give that one a watch. Also recommended the movie directed by Spike Jonze called Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix. If you remember, it's about Scarlett Johansson as an AI who a man in real life falls in love with. And then I recommended a couple of TV shows for us to stream, those being The Expanse and the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance. And then we kind of went over a study that was done where we were talking about how science fiction and the engagement with science fiction is actually a powerful tool for creating intellectual development within its viewership and its readers. And then we just went over the Rick and Morty trailer as well as a recommendation that I had called Neon Joe Werewolf Hunter. And that is going to be it for us this week. I just wanted to kind of remind everybody to, I guess, keep your head down, or keep your head up rather, and stay positive as we're going through a lot of these changes with COVID-19 and all of the shelter-in-place orders. I know that it can be really difficult. A lot of people have been laid off, and there's been a lot of unease just generally around the country as to when all of this is going to be over. But I think that we should take this time to kind of refocus ourselves in the way that we're doing life and the way that we're looking at things. And a great way to do that is to take a good hard look at what it is that we're consuming and think critically about it, and think about how we can be more effectively engaging with the content that is put in front of us and that we choose to watch. Next week, or the next episode that I do, we'll be back to some of the more familiar content, probably talking about something philosophical or some more deep and intellectual tropes within science fiction. I just wanted to kind of give you guys a swath of recommendations for this particular episode because it just felt like in these times of uncertainty, it's nice to just have some things to sit down and watch and contemplate on. So definitely let me know in the comments if you guys check any of this stuff out. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know what you might be interested in hearing about over the next couple of weeks. I'm definitely looking forward to getting you guys more content. Leave us a review, follow us on Twitter, all of that great stuff. And thanks again for joining us, everybody. Have a great week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.